All right, man, we're live. How is everyone doing so far? Hopefully everybody can go and check in and see what's up. All right, we are live, ready to go. I'd like to welcome everybody to the second Q&A with Randy Pike. That's me, brought to you today by Tekin, my main sponsor, and obviously where I work. I would like to take a moment to go ahead and thank the rest of my sponsors: Tekin, ProTech, A-Main Hobbies, J Concepts, KO Propo, Imaginate Graphics, Cichlids, Avid RC, BFast, and Factory RC. Those are all the sponsors I have at the moment, and we're always working with other companies quietly behind the scenes and getting some stuff done. So we'll start with a Q&A, and the more questions you guys ask, the more information we can share with everybody. So let's start with first question we have is, why do some people put two holes on opposite sides in the center of the tire and others vent their tires on the inside of the bead? This is from Mark Unrath. So good question. There's a couple of different ways to do this. I personally actually make this decision based on the tires in the class that I'm racing. So for example, on 8 scale, if I'm running, let's say, a double D tire, which is kind of like a Proline hole shot or something else of that nature, where they're small mini pins, I will typically try not to interrupt the actual tread of the tire, and I'll choose to vent it on the inside sidewall. And all you're trying to do is to allow the tire to expand and contract, as well as let the air go in and out of the tire. Now you can do this a couple different ways. You can also vent the wheel, but everyone I've talked to, including Jason at J Concepts, basically the only time you really need to vent the wheel is if you think the air can't get past the insert. And since nowadays we're using closed cell inserts, if that happens, if the insert actually sucks down onto the plastic rim and you have a hole there, obviously if that's your only hole between the tire and wheel assembly, the thing it'll deflect. In other words, there won't be any air moving in and out, which is also why you always do 2 holes, not just 1. I usually do them 180 degrees apart. On truggy tires, I've even been known to do 3 holes just to make sure that thing can expand and contract as fast as possible. So to answer your question, depending on the tread design is where I put the holes. I've also, on, like, for example, short course tires, I'll put them on the inside third of the tire where I put the holes instead of dead center in the tread, because if you run a short course a lot like I have been, that's rarely where you get the most tread wear. It's on the inside bead, just because of the way everything goes together around the track. So pretty good question, though. Let's see what else we got. Will there eventually be other functions added to the Hotwire/Android platform, like throttle profile? That's a good question. It's from Mike Kennedy. Yeah, the Android app is going to be a constant development. Right now, it's considered a beta app. It's also free. So once you download the app, we're doing a lot of research and development, checking against different operating systems, different devices, and what we can add to those and still allow to work smoothly on all the devices. So for example, the alpha test team has been testing data logging functionality on the Android app. So right now, the alpha test team, which is existing team drivers, can download a version of the app that actually has data logging on it. So for example, on the tablet, you go to data logging just like you do in the Hotwire PC version, download the run, and you can look at everything. You can scroll the data log together, you can expand it, you can zoom it, you can go in on certain points, you can move the cursor, just like you do on the PC version, now just on a handheld Android device. So yeah, there will be existing. For example, if you want to change your throttle profile, that'll be a development that we do later on where we can add that feature. Right now, we are still limited to some extent to some of the devices because it can require a lot of memory. It can require a lot of display. So it just depends on the device. But nowadays, the devices are so fast that I'm sure it'll be very, very soon where we can all start working on all the functions. So. Let's see. The next question is, This is pretty easy. What time does the Q&A start? Vex, it starts right now. Yeah, this one's going to require some translation, so bear with me for a minute, guys. Okay, unfortunately, this is a Spanish question, but I'm going to do my best to answer it. Basically, the loose translation I get from this is, what causes the solder connections to break off a solder post? Okay, so this is a pretty good question. Typically, when you see any solder joint fail, it's due to what we refer to as a cold solder joint. In other words, the joint might have melted and flowed together, but the actual metal connections between the two pieces didn't actually secure. 9 times out of 10, what I find is this is one of two things. Either two pieces weren't properly tinned, which is pre-soldered essentially, so the post wasn't pre-tinned and the wire wasn't pre-tinned, or the tip was too cold. In other words, you might feel the joint kind of take some adhesion, but it's only 20% or 30% of the adhesion versus the entire joint. So for example, on the RX-8, because the slots are so big, the trick is to take a piece of 12 gauge wire, pre-tin it, and while it's still warm and pliable, you crimp it with a pair of needle nose pliers so it makes a flat or a blade, which obviously fits inside that slot. So assuming that you pre-tin the solder post itself, pre-tin the wire, and crimp the wire, all you really need to do then is take a hot tip, a little bit extra solder, and put those two pieces together and flow it. And that'll make a really good secure solder joint. It's such a popular thing that we actually made a video. If you go to the Tekin YouTube channel, there's a video on how to solder an RX-8. We show you how to do wires horizontally and vertically. So I hope that answers your question for the translation. Excuse me. Okay, the next question from Robert Green. Will the app be available for the iPhone? This is a pretty good question. All I can say is we're working on it. Officially right now, it doesn't work on the iPhone, but I've said it before, and we've also mentioned before, if you've ever met us at trade shows and talked to us at some point, that we're not giving up on the iPlatform. Basically, we're looking at making it a separate device. And obviously, when you do certain things with devices, especially with Apple, they're pretty adamant about not doing certain things or asking users to do certain features to their phone. So to actually the app live on the store, there's quite a few hoops you have to jump through. And because of that, the device 9 times out of 10 also has to be somewhat approved. That being said, I'm not telling you no, and I'm not telling you yes. We're working on it. Chances are pretty good that you'll see a new device. That's about where I'll leave that. Hang on one sec. Looks like we might have another translation. Or is it just really gibberish? Okay. This question's from Jarrett Campbell. What is the best way to remove old solder off the posts of an RSX? Great question. So there's a couple different ways to remove solder. One requires a tool or stuff that's known as called solder braid. Solder braid can be picked up at Radio Shack or any other electronic store that carries solder, soldering irons, and those type of things. And what it is essentially is a metal braid, kind of like solder, but it's loosely kind of woven together, and the solder essentially wicks into the braid instead of staying on the component. The other thing you can do, you can get what's a tool called a solder sucker, and it basically is a spring-loaded device that once the solder is soft and liquid, you press the trigger on this device and it actually sucks the solder off the joint. The third way is obviously to use gravity. So if you basically take a speed controller, you warm up the solder and get the solder liquefied, you can turn the speed controller upside down and tap it on the table. Now obviously that loose and hot liquid solder is going to go somewhere, so make sure that there's a piece of cardboard, a rag, something protecting the table or whatever. You're going to basically throw that solder onto your lap, your shoe, your foot. I've seen guys drop it on a barefoot with a flip-flop and have a nice solder blister from it. So gravity's your friend in that case. So just once you get that solder warmed up and liquefied, just a gentle tap on a table will pretty much knock all the loose solder off of that and clean it up for you. Next question. On a TLR 3.0, standard gearing is, say, 45-13. Can you explain the mechanical advantage of going to 50-15? How is it more beneficial versus leaving it stock? I'd have to do the math on it really quick, but I'm pretty sure those gear ratios end up being the same. And so to answer your question, there really wouldn't be a huge benefit going between the two compared to each other, only because the bigger spur gear is essentially moving the motor outside the center line of the chassis, so you'll actually notice a handling difference. I would expect it to actually probably slow down a little bit in left to right transitions. Technically speaking, the 15 gearing might be quite good, because ideally if you go between two gears in the reduction, you want the bigger set of gears because they have the most contact patch. So if you think about this, the 13-tooth pinion has a smaller circumference than the 15-tooth pinion does, and because of that, when the teeth go to mesh, in other words, when they go to mesh like this, you've got more tooth contact on a 15-tooth pinion than a 13-tooth pinion when they go to transition. So as you get these teeth to kind of come down, the bigger pinion gear set will actually end up having more surface area, and is also why they're generally more quiet, because there's less functional load on those pieces. But because of the weight distribution of moving the motor off to one side, I probably wouldn't recommend it. Just for the record, if you're running a typical 1900 or 2050 setup on 4S, 45-13 gearing is undergeared for both of those motors. So that also may be part of the problem. On a typical size 8-scale track, 1900 4S, 45-15, 45-16 on the low-C, and a 2050 is one tooth different. So you might be 14-15 on the same car, same track. So if you're running 45-13 with either 2050 or 1900 on 4S, most likely you're undergeared unless you're running on a tight indoor track, in which case that's about the right gearing. So as long as everything's working fine, cool. But between the two gears, I would recommend the 45, just because of the handling qualities you'll get from the motor being closer to the center line of the chassis. I hope that answers your question. Now I do have a random question, since we're kind of running slow on questions at the moment. Does everyone see a small, like an applause button or something along these lines down at the bottom? Because I'm not live seeing it, and I'm just curious if everyone else sees it. So if someone sees that, let me know. Wait for a couple more questions. Okay, sorry about that. Waiting for a couple more questions to pop up. Here we go. So the Outback track rebuild, do you know how the dirt build helped their tire wear traction? It said, did they not go down on the base often? Too much water? They posted how they did it, but not why. Not exactly sure. I know what you're talking about, Tom. I imagine you're a local racer. So for those of you who don't know and watching online, the Outback Raceway is is part of A-Main Hobbies out in Chico, California. So that's their indoor track. It's where the J Concepts Indoor Summer Nationals here on the West Coast is held every year. And I know that Kevin Jelich is the one who's doing the track right now. And what he did was he actually took all the dirt out of the track area and dispersed it out into their parking lot and let it dry. Then he basically worked the dirt, to the best of my knowledge. He worked the dirt, got it basically mixed up all together, pulverized the big clods, which is really 9 times out of 10 the biggest problem when you work with dirt with clay in it, is getting it broken down. Got it broken down to where it was more of a very soft fluff or a dust or just really, really small particles, basically, and then basically tractored it back into the track and then built the track with that. So what he did was, instead of basically doing what most people do, which is rototill all the dirt exactly where it sits inside the track barriers, he actually removed the dirt, pulled it outside, let it bake in the sun, tilled it out there, broke it down even smaller, and then trucked it back in or tracking it back in with the Bobcat, then built the track. And what this allowed the track to do was compact easier. So the particles are smaller, so everything adhered better, which gave you a smoother track surface, which helps with the consistency. It also helps with water, because now he's able to water the top of the track and everything just absorbs it equally, where before with the big particles, the water wouldn't necessarily essentially soak into the track evenly. So you would have super wet spots, super dry spots, and any of that gives you an inconsistent track surface. So I'm kind of speaking out of tongue a little bit because I didn't do it, but from what I understand, that's what Kevin Jelich did just off watching the pictures and stuff like that. I believe that's also why the tire wears down when the grip's actually consistent, because the track is smoother. There's less of an edge to the track, so the tire wear has been a little bit better. Okay, so there's only the thumbs. Okay, the thumbs is what I was actually asking for. Thanks, Mike, for letting me know. And basically, it's an applause thing. So if you guys see or hear a specific part of the video that you really like, do me a favor, hit the thumbs button. It kind of gives me some feedback, whether it's bad or good. Either way, you hit the thumbs up, thumbs down button, and that way I know what we can focus on for the next Q&A and kind of go from there as far as what you guys want to hear for questions and stuff like that. So thanks, Mike, for letting me know that's on. The image is frozen. Yeah, hi, Steve Taylor. I'm not sure if anybody else is having the same problem. So if anybody is also having a frozen screen thing, let me know, I guess. Okay, so here's another question. Can you define active brake and push control? Sure, I can do that. So active brake is essentially what I refer to as a brake multiplier. So if you think of your brake system on a speed controller, when you're a driver, you've got what's called push brake. So anytime I'm actually physically applying brake to the transmitter with my finger, that's called push brake. If you go into a mode, if you're active, say an RSX, which is active brake default 3, if you're in active braking mode, if you panic brake, in other words, if you slap brake, we actually increase the braking strength kind of exponentially because we know it's a panic. So in other words, we're trying to give you the maximum amount of brake force that you can get from the system that you're running. If you turn that down, you get less of a multiplier. And then, for example, what this allows you to do is if you ease into the brakes, like for example, coming off the straightaway and you ease into the brakes, you don't get the multiplier to initiate. But if you panic brake, then we give you the maximum amount of brake. So what this allows you to do is increase your overall brake strength to where you can use it on the track when you're gently getting into brakes or you're not panicking. But when you do panic brake, we give you all the amount of brakes that you can actually ask for. That being said, to give you an idea, in a two-wheel drive modified buggy, most of us turn the active braking off because in modified buggy, and especially the one that's only two-wheel drive, all we are allowed to have is a rear braking from the tires in the back. So you want the smoothest possible brakes you can get, and we really don't need an additional brake, even in a panic setting, because 9 times out of 10, if you panic brake a two-wheel drive buggy, you're probably going to just spin it out. Conversely, on, say, for example, a two-wheel drive short course truck, to where your infield braking and your straightaway braking might feel a little bit different, but for example, doing big jumps, you want as much braking force as you can get in those instances, especially in a panic mode when you do a brake slap, you want as much brake force as you can get, and that allows you to bring the nose of the two-wheel drive short course down. So on my two-wheel drive short course, for example, stock or mod, most of the time I'm in active brake 1 or 2. Now, push control is the opposite of drag brake. Push control actually applies throttle or power to the motor once you've let off and gone to neutral for a specific amount of time. And we actually, for example, measure how much time you're spent at wide open throttle and count that back down on push control. So the higher the number you have push controller set, the more power you're going to be given for a longer period of time once you go to neutral. I don't typically ever use this in off-road, but for example, guys who race stock, if back in the days when we ran brushed motors, we actually used to trim up the throttle to basically free up the car in the corners, and we called it creep, because basically you had to hold the brakes on at the start of the car, of the main, because if you didn't, the car would just start rolling. That was why it got called creep. In a brushless system, you don't typically do that because it causes problems. They won't arm, things of this nature. So push control essentially accomplishes the same goal. So in stock, buggy, touring car, whatever it is, a lot of guys are starting to use the push control because it does free up the car in the corners, which allows you to get off the straightaway, for example, go to neutral, let the car settle with the power being applied instead of you having to control it. A lot of guys aren't as smooth as they are on the initial throttle inputs, so they let the push control take over, which frees up the car consistently, and they're able to go around the track faster lap time was. Some of the guys in four-wheel drive short course also tend to use this to keep the nose of the truck up on big jumps. So you really have to experiment with it. It doesn't take a lot. So even 10% of push control is quite a bit in off-road. And on-road, it's a different story just because the on-road cars scrub so much speed in the corners that push control can help push them around. A lot of times, though, the on-road guys will find that if they're using push control, their suspension setup's not as good as it could be, and they'll usually make a suspension change instead. But it'll accomplish the same goal. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, here's another question from Robert Green. Many probably have seen you sharing information about sponsorship. Excuse me. Can you let us know about when the application might be available and what you might be looking for, and what is the biggest turnoff on a resume? Okay, so Tekin, we would generally post up the sponsorship application, the process, the guidelines, and what we want to see from you around the end of October. And then basically once that's all posted, the email is activated where you can send all that stuff in. And typically what we ask for is a racer's resume. And we're going to ask for the application to be filled out, which will be available online in PDF format. And it's just a simple form where you fill in the blanks, some specific information that we ask you. And I always ask, now typically I like to get podium shots, but I do get action shots. And if you're not sure, send more than one. But basically what I'm looking for is, how do you look when you're at the racetrack? Now, some guys may not, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, you're a representative of the company. So if you're at the racetrack and you're getting a podium shot and you've got raggedy jeans, it looks like you've slept in your shirt for a week and it's dirty and filthy, that doesn't necessarily represent well for the company that you're representing. So that's why it's important to get the race photos. It also shows that you take the same amount of time to prep a race car as you do yourself. So all those things generally translate. What I like to see in a resume, I typically like to see bio information, pretty basic stuff just because I'm not trying to write a book about you, but what I am trying to get is a little bit of information about who you are as a person, what you're about, maybe what you do for a living, how often do you race, you know, how are you, what's your life basically like, how often do you do these things. One of the biggest turnoffs is for me is sometimes it's spelling, but a lot of times it's lack of information. So for example, one of my biggest turnoffs is when I am looking at a list of race results and I see things like, pick a random race, the Outback Shootout. I finished in the A main. Well, you finished in the A main, but what position? Was it 10th? Was it 8th? Was it 1st? Was it 2nd? Because while it's not necessarily cool to finish 4th or 5th or 8th or 9th or 10th, at least you made the A. Now, obviously that's not a whole lot of weight if there was only 10 guys or 11 guys because everybody's in the A. But at the same time, leaving that information off for me is a red flag because that tells me that you probably didn't get the podium, and maybe that's what I see often from you. So for example, if all your results say A main finish, or I got A main results that weekend, or top 10 or whatever it is, when you leave out those details for me, it starts to question some integrity and did you do it on purpose? So even finishing 7th or 8th of the A main, still finishing in the A main. I also like to see on big races, for example, that I might not be familiar with. If there's a big local annual race that you get and there's 200 something entries and there was 70 guys in the A main and you made top 7 out of 70 guys is pretty good most of the time. So if that's the racing circumstances that you had for that event, write it down. Our recent J Concepts Indoor Summer Nationals had 70 guys in four-wheel drive buggy. So making the A main was a big deal considering guys in the A main were Mark Pavidis and Brian Mayfield and half a dozen other professional drivers, and some of those guys didn't make the A. So yeah, that's a big deal. Write that kind of stuff down. References are a huge thing. I personally like to have 2 forms of contact for all the references on the resume. I like to have an email and a phone number. And the reason why is nowadays with everyone having caller ID, not everyone answers the phone to a phone number they don't recognize. However, everyone answers emails most of the time. So if they get an email from me and I say, hey, Randy Pike at Tekin, most of the time the success rate's pretty high. But sometimes, like 75% of the time, I'll get through to a phone call, but there's that 25% that I don't. And so if I can't get a hold of references, it makes it really hard for me to track down and find out who you are. So I'm left to Google search you, check social media, and I'll find out some information. And I've been known to call the racetracks that you visit or frequent and ask a random person who answers the phone if they know who you are. So all of these things kind of add up onto a resume. The other thing is clarity. Make sure it's clear. Make sure it reads pretty well. Have someone else read it for you. Make sure you didn't misspell something or misphrase it or forget a component. I personally don't like to see results past 3 years. unless there's something super significant like a national championship or something along those lines. But a lot of it just has to do with putting it together and spending some time. If you basically are sending a resume or an application, it looks like it's something I can do in 10 minutes. To me, that's an immediate turnoff, because it tells me you didn't take the time to put any effort to make that application or that resume that you're giving me. Because if you don't do it then, and when it basically 9 times out of 10 is your first impression to us, means that you might not take that same time at a racetrack when it comes to helping a customer with product, helping a fellow racer with his setup, answering some questions, helping a hobby shop owner. So to bring it full circle, the more time and dedication that generally I see someone putting into an app and a resume, the more time that I will traditionally take a look and look into that driver further, even if I don't like what I see first blush. If I see that you put in the time and effort, I'll actually put in a little bit extra time and effort to find out who that person is. So take your time, do a good resume, spell check it, have 2 or 3 guys review it for you. Make sure you have good, clean, crisp pictures that are legible and I can see stuff. And best of luck to everyone that applies. I know last year, I think I got about 800 or 900 plus applications for Tekin last year. So we get inundated with them pretty hard. It does take me a while to get back to you, but I try to respond to every single resume or application that we get. And that'll bring me to the last comment. Make 100% sure that you have an email address as a form of contact on that resume. I even put it on the application, but I swear I'll have 15, 20 guys who send me an application that's blank, which is missing the email address. And on all their resume, I don't have their email on that application for a point of contact or any of their contact information. And unfortunately, because I get so many emails, I actually can't go back to my email list and reply to them and find their email, because there's just far too many to do that too. So always make sure your contact information is on there. Make sure your email address is spelled correctly. Make sure your phone number is spelled on there correctly, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully that answers some questions for you. Yep, thumbs up, thumbs down. That's what I'm looking for. So if you like what we're talking about, hit thumbs up. And if you don't like it, hit thumbs down. It just gives me a little bit of feedback about what we're doing here and what I'm trying to answer some questions, and kind of also lets you know, the rest of the people that are watching online, what they like and what they don't like. So let's get some more questions in here that we can keep the conversation going. Make sure you share this and share it on their pages and stuff like that, so we can get more people going. Thanks. What are your expectations of a sponsored driver that represents Tekin? So this is a great question. So typically, if you're a sponsored driver for Tekin, there's some expectations that are said and some are unsaid. But what I like to do is obviously have everyone be a general good person at the racetrack. This means being courteous, cleaning up after yourself, making sure the place was better than it was when you got there. You know, not throwing garbage all over the place. Take care of the pit. Be courteous to the drivers around you. Be courteous to the people who own the racetrack, who work at the racetrack. We don't like to have a bunch of foul language on the team running around. I mean, you're at a racetrack, you're at a public place. Granted, it can be passionate sometimes and it can be hectic and everyone can be amped up. But at the same time, you got to remember that nowadays with camera phones and cell phones and video and social media, some of the smallest things in the world can get blown out of proportion. So all of that can basically reflect poorly on any of your sponsors. I was at a race recently where 2 guys got into it over a corner marshal, and one guy wasn't paying attention, and one guy, was yelling at him from the driver's stand, and those guys got into it and both were ejected. So both of those guys had sponsors, and the best of my knowledge from what I've heard, both of those guys lost the majority of those sponsors because of that action, because it was a lot of foul language, and they got a couple complaints from some moms that were there with small kids. And you got to think of those kind of things ahead of time. I mean, there's just never a good place for it. And that's the biggest thing for us, really. And it comes after that. I want guys who can get me good results on a consistent basis. I like guys who are consistently showing well at the racetrack, who know how to set up the equipment. I know that Tekin in the past has been kind of set up to be, or we've gotten what's the word I'm looking for here, the perception that we're overly difficult to set up and get dialed in. And with the new stuff, it's pretty much ready to go out of the box. And so we still need drivers to be able to help set those up quickly for customers, help diagnose problems, be aware of how all the products work, which products to go and which platforms. Does an RX-8 belong in a 2-wheel drive buggy? No, generally it doesn't. But we expect our drivers to kind of know that stuff. Our speed controllers have a lot of diagnostic abilities, for example, using the LEDs. So I expect the drivers to know what those diagnostics do, how to use them, for example. One I get often a lot of questions about that people don't realize is there is a sensor checker feature. All of the Generation 1 and Generation 2 brushless sensored speed controllers that Tekin makes. So RS Pro Generation 1, and RS Generation 1, RS Gen 2, RS Gen 2 Spec, RSX, and RX8 Gen 2 and Gen 1 all have a sensor checker built into that speed controller. So what you can do is power up the system, spin your motor by hand, and you can watch the last 3 LEDs cycle on and off. And what this shows you is that the speed controller is reading the sensors from the motor. This verifies that the speed controller sees it and it's good. It verifies the sensor harness is good because it sees the sensors, and it verifies the sensors in the motor are working. You can even test a motor that isn't hooked up to your speed controller with just the sensor harness. And again, like a lot of things, we have a video on our YouTube channel that shows how this feature works and how you can use it to diagnose bad sensors. I mean, it's just one of those problems that we have from time to time in RC. Sensor wires go bad, sensor boards and motors go bad, and so this feature is a really important one. And as a team driver, that's something I would expect the guys to know. I also like to see drivers get on forums. Forums are huge. Social media is huge. So any online interaction, while not necessarily is required, we do like to see it. So we like to have guys that go on forums and help answer questions and help do support, because there quite frankly is too many local forums that we might not be aware of or not be able to frequent on a relatively frequent basis. So we actually expect the drivers to kind of do some of that stuff for us. We don't make requirements for everyone to post on social media. A lot of this stuff is we recommend it or like to see the activity. Competition is so fierce for team driver positions. Generally speaking, the guys that do it, commonly or frequently, and we know that they're doing actively, tend to hold their positions better because it's a competition like anything else. I mean, you're racing cars for a living. These guys are taking these team driver positions quite strongly. So there's a lot of people trying to vie for those positions. Can I explain active brake does and TICA speedos? A higher number usually means more aggressive brakes, but can you explain what it does? Okay, for some of those of you guys that might have missed it, I did kind of answer this question earlier, but I'll go ahead and review it again. Active brake is essentially a brake multiplier. So the higher the number of the sets, when you do it into a panic brake function, in other words, if you slap the push brake, the active brake will get engaged and will give you the maximum amount of brake force that we can give you at that time. So it essentially doesn't necessarily override your brake strength setting, it just multiplies it. And what this allows you to do is set the majority of the track for push brake around the track. So if, say, for example, the infield or the end of the straightaway where most guys tend to set up their brakes. So most guys go and set their push brake to a low enough setting to where they don't spin out at the end of the freeway. What can be a problem is, and especially on the heavier cars, is that you don't have enough brake strength to snap the front end down over a jump. And typically the one I use all the time for this is two-wheel drive short course. So if you set your brake strength settings to say like 80%, so you don't spin out at the end of the straightaway, but there's a big double or a triple where you need to hit it really hard, hit it really fast, but then at 80% brake strength, you don't have enough brake to snap the nose of the truck down. Increasing your active brake setting will help with that. And so, for example, my settings for us when I run a 7.5 is my active braking is actually turned to 1 or 2, depending on the size of the jumps. Then I set my brake strength setting, whether it's either the speed controller inside or using your EPAs on your transmitter to set the rest of my brake power around the track. Active brake's only induced when you basically have an immediate brake input from the user. If you just lean into the brakes or go into them softly, active brake doesn't get engaged. But if you slap the brakes, or what I refer to as panic brake, active brake gets engaged. We increase the brake strength with the multiplier, and you just get really, really strong brakes out of it. So hopefully that explains your question. I see a lot of guys running multiple caps on their ESC, sometimes up to 4 or 5 at a time. They say it's for more power punch, a huge difference, quote unquote. What's your take on this? I thought caps are there to handle ripple current and heat. Craig Patterson, you're correct, sir. There are a lot of things floating around right now in the RC industry called super caps or mega caps or wonder caps, for example, whatever you want to call them. And unfortunately, they don't exactly increase punch. And the way I can explain this is, let's go over ripple current first. Ripple current is the phenomenon that if you've got battery voltage here, and let's say it's 8 volts, and you pull this under a load, under acceleration, and it drops down to 7 volts, for example, that's a ripple. And then what happens is when you let off the throttle, either go to brakes or let off and the load goes away, the voltage spikes back up to 8 volts and up to higher voltage at this point. That is a ripple. So this bounce that we're referring to as ripple current is on the voltage rail. The whole job of the capacitor when it's hooked to that voltage rail is to control the bounce. So instead of having a big bounce like this fast, you will get a small bounce slowly, and that's what you're there for. Now, the more, in theory, the more caps you have, the more ripple current you can handle But that's all the caps do. The caps don't necessarily increase voltage or amplify voltage, which is essentially what's actually making the punch. So if the caps were, for example, saying absorbing voltage and then being able to store it for long periods of time, you would see that. The problem is that most of the caps that people are using for these things are slow discharging. So for example, there's one that I won't name, but essentially it's a small box called a super cap. And one of the tests that they show on their website is they have a battery running a fan, a small cooling fan, and the capacitor is in line. They unplug the battery, but then the fan runs for about another 20 seconds. That shows you how slow the capacitor system discharges. If it discharged quickly and the fan spun extremely quickly, but then stopped spinning within a couple seconds, that would be a quick discharging cap. That would be okay. But the stuff that discharges slowly doesn't necessarily help anything, especially in stock, which is where you see most of these guys using it. Now, on the flip side of this is that generally the cap's job to handle the ripple current is also there to handle the heat, because the more ripple current you have, the hotter the speed controller will run. And obviously a hot speed controller has more resistance. So because of that resistance, yes, that can affect punch. So conversely, a lot of this comes down to your efficiency of your setup, the good quality of your batteries. Really good batteries. I use ProTech. So I use ProTech batteries, and if I go to my data logs after runs, my battery won't bounce around all that much, hardly any at all. I mean, you see it bounce when you hit full throttle, but the ripple current is really, really smooth. So the voltage line is relatively smooth. In other words, the line is smooth. It's got some bumps to it, but no big spikes and not a lot of noise. If you see a lot of noise on your data logger, that is another sign that your batteries aren't doing that well. So for example, if I use a 20C battery versus a 50 or 70C battery, the 20C batteries will have a lot more ripple current. Because of that, the speed controller will run hotter, and the capacitors you would need to handle that ripple current will be more. That's where more caps help. And modified, because we're pulling so much amperage from the batteries, it also helps make the speed controllers run cool. More caps can help there. So for example, like mod touring car. A mod touring car would be helpful because you're running a 4-turn or a 5-turn motor, you're pulling a lot of amps, you're on the throttle, on the brakes, and that ripple current can affect the speed controller temperature. Again, more caps can help. The difference between, for example, 2 of our 3520 caps, which are low ESR caps, versus 5 caps of somebody else, our caps that we spec on a Tekin speed controller are what's called low ESR. In other words, they're quick reacting. They absorb power quickly, and they basically discharge power extremely quickly. Because of this speed, we don't need a humongous cap. And everybody notices that the cap that we stock on all that speed controllers is a TT3520, and we only spec 1 because that's really all our system needs. Because of that cap that we're putting on there, it's a little bit expensive, but at the same time, it means 1 cap, it means a small cap, and it's an efficient setup. The more caps you have on there, technically, yes, it can help, but it will never increase the punch directly like it was back in the brush days. Back in the brush days, the capacitor was a little bit different because of the motor design we were using then. Plus, the batteries weren't as good. Now, because the batteries are so good, and they hold voltage so high for so long, it really doesn't make a big difference. So you can run a super cap if you want. If it makes you feel better, go ahead, by all means, do it. It's racing. Some guys swear by them. I personally, I've already tested it. I've never seen a difference. I've never seen differences in my lap times. I honestly don't even notice the difference when I'm running Tekin equipment. Maybe somebody else is doing some other stuff. I know that guys who typically run lower quality batteries might notice it more than guys who run really high quality batteries. So take it for what it's worth. We don't generally recommend them. I've actually even seen some of the super caps cause problems with the speed controller and the motor system because of noise. So take it with a grain of salt. If you're running Tekin stuff and you really want to try extra caps, pick up an extra package of a TT3520s, wire 2 of them in series, or excuse me, 2 of them in parallel, and run them as close as you can to the speed controller and see if you notice it. I hope that answers your question. Hang on one sec. Sorry, boss man trying to chime in real quick. I'll say hi to Jim Campbell, who's watching online. Answer another question. Talking about data logs, do you pull your log or at the end of the race day, giving you clear the list prior to the start of the day? This is a great question. So All the Generation 2 speed controllers for Tekin, so RS Gen 2, RS Gen 2 Spec, RSX, and RX8 Gen 2 have a data logger inside. I will generally run the data logger when I'm using it actively. I will either do it when I'm checking out gearing. I will do it a lot when I'm testing. And if I'm at a big race, I will typically do it on one of my best qualifiers. So I always make it a habit to clear the run before I am ready to hit the track. That way, if I have a really good clean run, no mistakes, no laps, I had no problems with traffic. In other words, I felt that it was a complete run as fast as I could, as hard as I could. I will download that run and store it for later. And the reason why that is I know that I pushed the system as hard as I possibly could. So I get to make sure I've got enough battery voltage for runtime, make sure my motor's not running too hot, make sure my gearing is good by looking at the RPMs, and make sure my speed controller is not running hot or getting close to thermal, because typically speaking, I don't run fans on my RSX, for example. Even in my four-wheel drive buggy, I don't need it. But it's nice to know that I can check it. The cool part is that if you do what you're supposed to do, at least locally racing, once you're done racing, you got to put your car and your system back in a box and go out and corner marshal. So unless you carry a temp gun in your pocket, which I don't anymore now with the data logging, I don't have to worry about it. I can see the exact highest temperature I got in my motor, how fast I got there, when did it steady state out, things of this nature. So I am always in the habit of clearing my car data log every time I get to throw that car down on the track. That way, if I have that magic run, I can pull it out and get the best data out of it that I want. The data logger will only hold so much data from the run, and it doesn't auto clear, which is a big misconception. If you want to get a fresh, recent run, you need to clear that run out and make sure the memory's got room for that next run. It can hold multiple runs, and it can hold a lot of runs depending on how fast the sample rate is and how many data streams you're recording. And what I refer to as a data stream is throttle is a data stream, motor RPM is a data stream, battery voltage is a data stream. So for example, there's 6 streams. There's throttle, battery voltage, motor temp, speedo temp, BEC voltage, and I'm missing one right now. I can't think of it. That's awesome. Anyways, there's those data streams there. The less streams you're recording, the more memory locations there are to record to. So in other words, think of it as a glass. If I have 5 streams of water going in to fill the glass, it doesn't take much time to fill the glass. But if I'm only filling that glass with 1 glass of water, I can do a lot of time on it. So if there's some specific stuff, if I'm doing stock racing, which is rare, but if I'm doing it, I really don't care about my throttle. I really don't care about my BEC voltage. So I'll turn those streams off, for example. I also generally don't care about speed controller temp, because in stock, there's no way I'm going to thermal it. So I'll turn that off as well. And what this allows me to do is run the maximum resolution, which means the more samples I get per second, which gives me better quality of the sample, more detail, and allows me to get more than one run in. So for example, I might get 2 6-minute runs, killing some streams and getting max sample rate. And in stock racing, I'm looking at motor RPM is important for gearing, and then the motor temperature. Those are the 3 most important streams in stock racing, in my opinion, that I use most frequently. So data logging is a whole nother conversation, but we definitely can start answering more questions. So if you've got a data logger question, make sure it's pretty specific so I can get through them quickly, because I could talk about that for hours. It's a lot of good information, and there's a lot of stuff. It's racing, so there's a lot of angles to approach. So if you've got a data logger question or something specific about how I might use it, ask the question and we'll get some answers going. Okay, currently drive a Techno 4x4 short course truck, RX8. I'm not sure what 2012 firmware is, but we'll work with it. Pro 4 4600, I tried the HD and went up 2 teeth on the HD and left all the settings the same. The motor cut out before the end of a 5-minute race. Ideas. Okay, so here's a couple questions, Stephen, and a couple of statements first. You did the right thing by going between the 4600 and going to the 4300 HD. Typically, we recommend going up 1 or 2 teeth, so you got that covered. I don't typically see speed controller settings needing to be changed between the 2, so that's probably a 2. And here's something you might not realize. In none of the Tekin speed controllers currently, with any of the current software, we do not thermally protect the motor. In other words, we will let you burn that motor to the ground, including our own motor, because we consider it to be a racing thing. We're racing. We're pushing the limits of everything. We're in competition. The last thing I want is my speed controller shutting down the throttle or my ability to drive that car because my motor was 5 degrees hotter than the cutoff was, and I missed the start line by 10 feet. So we'll let you run that motor until you turn it off. So the fact that it shut off at the end of a 5-minute race is my thought is I guess I got some questions first. Were you running a fan on your RX8? If so, did you verify that it's working? My next question is what battery are you running and how many milliamp hours does it have? And are you 100% sure that that battery was charged fully that particular run? So I know you can answer those questions for me here in a minute. So do me a favor, answer those questions. And also, I'm curious on what 2012 firmware is, because that's a couple years ago, and I'm not really sure what that is. It'd also be good to know if it was an RX-8 Gen 1 or Gen 2. So if you can answer a couple of those questions in your next question to me, I'll try to basically help diagnose that a little bit further. But I mean, you got my attention now, so let's go with that. With the exception of data logging, what, if any, of the advantage of going to Gen 2 versus Gen 1? Okay, perfect question. The RX-8 Gen 1 was a great speed controller. Had a couple years good running, dominated the class as an 8 scale. Certainly was a speed controller to have in forward drive short course, but we wanted to build upon it. And what we built upon it was a little bit stronger case, a little bit better BEC. That's the biggest feature, in my opinion, between a Gen 1 and Gen 2 that's really worth the upgrade. The BEC in the RX-8 Generation 1 was a 6-volt, 5-amp BEC. The RX-8 Gen 2 has a 6-volt or 8-volt high voltage BEC up to 7 amps. So the BEC basically allows you to run high voltage servos at the proper voltage level and the amp draw that they might need. The BECs are pretty much standard in anything like a forward drive short course or an 8-scale buggy, and especially an 8-scale trugging. Once you've tried a high voltage servo, you probably will never go back to a standard 6-volt servo. Don't get me wrong, excuse me, the 6-volt servos are really, really good now and they're getting there. But if you can run high voltage, the benefit of this is less amp draw. Anytime I can increase the voltage in the system, I will reduce my amp draw pulling the same load. And that's why high voltage is a good thing. So for example, in a forward drive short course on 2S, you're pretty much getting straight battery voltage going to that servo, which allows it to draw less amperage and run cooler, which obviously makes it more efficient, which makes it faster for you to drive and more consistent. So if you're looking for a reason to upgrade, that's probably my number one. My number two would be the data logging. Data logging is not super important in forward drive short course or 8-scale buggy because 9 times out of 10 we have more power than we can use. We're not really worried about runtime, but it is nice to go back and make sure your speedo temp was within range. It is nice to know that you had enough battery voltage at the end of the race so you weren't going soft, and it's definitely nice to know how hot your motor was. It's amazing to see how many guys really don't check that stuff and then find out later that they've got a bent pinion shaft, or they've got a bad spur gear, or they've got some bearings in their rear hub going to pot. And because of the amount of horsepower and torque the 8-scale systems can deliver, we'll burn the bearings down to the ground and melt the hub and shear it off the rear rim. And the guy didn't realize it until it actually was too late. And the run before that, his motor was 280 degrees. So it's kind of nice to have. Those are the two biggest reasons to upgrade to a Generation 2, the high voltage BEC and a data logger feature. Okay, next question. Is there a way to smooth out my driving? I was told that I have a heavy throttle finger. I keep up with the other fast guys, always me, but I find myself blowing it into the corners. My setup is a Gen 2 RX-8 with a 1900. Currently we're set to 45. Gearing is 1646. Okay, with that gearing, I'm going to assume that you're driving one of a few cars, either a low CMU, a Kyosho, the cars that are in that line, the Agama, and some other ones. But going to your setup, and the fact that you have a heavy throttle finger, there's a couple things to consider. You already got your current limiter down to 45. Your gearing's pretty much proper for a typical size 8-scale track, so that's okay. One of the things you can look at doing is actually not making an adjustment to the speed control. You can start making an adjustment to your diff oils. If you're blowing corners, I'm assuming you're blowing the corners either going in or going out, and that's going to be a lot of that's going to have to do with your center diff oil. Typically speaking, the lighter your center diff oil is, the easier the car is to drive coming out of the corners. This is my experience. The heavier that is, the more the car wants to dart around and grab things. So on my low speed, when I run that car, I'm typically running a 753 setup, and that's just what I like personally. If the grip is really high, I'll go to a 773 setup or even a 772 setup, depending on how much steering I need. But typically, the center differential is usually what I adjust for that. The other thing you can start doing, and this depends on your radio system, is you can start playing with the exponential. If it's a bottom end you're trying to control, you can add some negative exponential on your radio to control the bottom end to make it less sensitive. The other setting that I would ask you to make sure that is set properly is your minimum throttle. Make sure that that's set to 0. If you need more setup questions outside that, you can hit me up at rpike@teamtekin.com, and we can go over your setup and try to get you more dialed in after that as well. because I'm sure I'll have more questions like what's the track size, what's the surface look like, and I'm not sure we can really get that done on the video with live chat going on, but we'll give it a shot. Yeah, definitely. When you're talking about those capacitors and the super caps and stuff like that, that's pretty much the rage that we're seeing at the local racing stock. Stock is big right now. It's kind of gone in circle. Back in the days, stock was pretty big and mod was really quiet, and then mod got fast, and we're kind of going back to the point where stock's the most competitive racing. It's pretty much where everyone's at now. I know locally we don't even have a mod buggy class anymore. It's all stock. But understand that if you can't increase the battery voltage, if you can't basically get rid of resistance and a couple of these things, it can't affect punch. This is one of the things that was nice about brush speed controllers back in the days when you used to have things called regenerative braking, and I'm pretty sure Tekin invented. Regenerative braking basically allowed you to use the motor as a generator to take that voltage and put it back on the battery pack, which then increased punch over the length of the run. The problem is we don't necessarily do that in brushless, and if we could, we obviously would, but then on top of that, the batteries are so good. In the typical stock two-wheel drive buggy, even on an 8-minute race, you might use 2,000 milliamp hours out of a 2S battery, and it's a shorty. So it's not enough to really even cause any problems. It's not like we're lacking voltage. You're going to find better things to do with finding the optimal gearing using the data logger than you will be adding 16 capacitors to your speed controller. So ideally, 9 times out of 10 when I travel to a track, local track, or even when I'm traveling outside of my local area for a big race, I watch cars in the stock class go around the racetrack, and I'd say over half of them are clearly overgeared when I watch that car go around the track. Even at Nationals, I was helping one of our factory drivers. He had fast lap times. His car was good, but I watched his car go around the track, and he was overgeared. I could tell just by watching it, and I had him drop 2 pinion teeth, which was 3 pinion teeth lower than anybody else on the racetrack after talking to them, and his lap times dropped 2/10. Now, granted, it might not have been the super fastest car around the straightaway, but when you got to think about it is on a typical racetrack, the straightaway is only 5%, 10% maybe on the biggest of the racetrack. And so you're going to find better lap times focusing on your car setup, your gearing setup for optimization than simply adding more capacitors to your car. And I think the capacitors are overrated personally. Okay, we're going back to Steven's issue with his short course truck. He had a fan that was working as a Generation 1 RX-8 with a big SMC battery pack, and it was charged. Happened 3 races and 3 different batteries in a row. Switched to a 4600 no problem. Temp at 187 and the motor 168. Okay. Let me think about this for a minute. If all you're doing is swapping out the motor, and you're going from the 4600 and you make runtime, so the problem is it's 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, there's no way you should be dumping a 6500 milliamp battery pack, especially an SMC. It could be a bad sensor board potentially in the motor, which if it was too short or kind of short or glitch, that could affect the BEC, but I would expect it to rebound pretty quickly. The way to test that is to put the 4300 back in and run it sensorless. Yes, it might cog a little bit. Yes, it might not be as consistent, but if all you have to do to make runtime is unplug the sensor harness and the 4300 system works for you, makes runtime, then at least we're narrowing it down as far as to what the problem is. You should be able to swap the sensor boards between the 4600 and the 4300 if that first test passes to verify 100% that we're right. But my other concern would be, and I guess my next question would be, is after that run with the 4300 HD, how many milliamp hours went back into the battery? If you go to run this test again later and you put in 6,000 milliamp hours of a 6500 milliamp battery in 5 minutes, something's wrong with the setup, and that's also why your car is shutting off. You're hitting voltage cutoff. So the next test would be to run the 4300 without the sensor harness, and then during that run, make sure it's for 5.5 minutes or 6 minutes, whatever it was last time it shut off, pull the car off, charge that battery back up, and notate how many milliamp hours go back into that battery. If it's into the 5,800 to 6,000 range, you're hitting voltage cutoff on the track. I would start to question the gearing for that particular track layout. So I would ask, which track is it? How long is the straightaway? And how many milliamp hours did you put back in the battery? And did running it sensorless fix the time as far as how much time it took to to shut the system off. Because we don't thermally protect the motor, it has nothing to do with the motor temperatures. I mean, your temperatures look fine, 187 on the motor or and 168 on the speedo or vice versa. Those are completely within optimal range. The other question might be what steering, servo, and system that you have, but I wouldn't expect changing the motor to affect any of that, but I'd still ask the question just to eliminate it as a possibility. If we're going to get big into details with this, Steven, shoot me an email at rpike@teamtecan.com. Do me a favor, try to repeat most of these settings and stuff that we're asking or talking about, and we'll get you dialed in to figure out what's going on with that. Probably a little bit too much to go back and forth on here, but we'll get you through email and get you sorted out. Ooh, cool question. What's the best track facility you've been to in the past year or so? Oh, the past year. That's a good question. One of the better ones I've visited lately would be Traction Raceway up in Reno, Nevada. It's a nice indoor facility, really good consistent traction, nice big size 10 scale track, good driver stand. Had plenty of pit spaces for the race that we were attending at the time. The other one that I frequent often and I'm at more than once a year is the Outback Raceway. It's one of my favorite indoor tracks that I travel to often. It's on the smaller side as far as some of the bigger 10 scale super tracks. But because of Kevin Jellick and him making the track layouts and designs, the jumps, his just overall layouts are phenomenal to run on. The track's always in top shape. The facility is always nice and clean. You're basically in the backside of A-Main Hobby, so if you need anything at all, you can order it online. They bring it back out to you in the pits. Plenty of pitting, air-conditioned pit spaces, good driver stand, good lighting, just no problems. Silver Dollar is another one that's an outdoor track, also owned by A-Main. That's actually where the 2013 IFMAR Worlds were held. Ridiculously fantastic facility. I love going there. Trying to think of, I have yet to actually unfortunately make OCRC Raceway, but I hear that's one of the other better facilities to travel to. I haven't made it there, but I got some more trips coming up at the end of the year. The other track is actually a temporary track. It's the IIC, which is the International Indoor Championships. It's hosted by Scotty Ernst. That's actually held at the Riviera Hotel, which is actually in a couple of weeks. I never raced that race, but it's an indoor carpet race visited by people all over the world, and by far is one of the best events I ever attend, and I don't even race it. For your event entry fee, certain classes get tires with the entry fee, but you also get fed 2 or 3 times during the week. There's a cool meet and greet one night where there's beer and tacos, all you can eat and all you can drink, and you get to rub elbows with all the pro drivers and talk to the manufacturers and have an impromptu trade show. Great facility. Scotty puts on a great show. It's a lot of fun racing. You basically never have to leave the hotel. It's a lot of fun. If you're in Vegas in that time frame, I definitely recommend even just stopping by and checking it out. It's really, really cool. But as far as the tracks I've gone to, I actually haven't traveled to a lot of big races this year that I would normally like to go, but this is that time of year where I start traveling a little bit more and hitting up some more races. So one of the overall facilities I've ever traveled to was Mike's Hobby Shop out in Porter, Texas. Fantastic facility, and it's actually sad to see that they're making him move it. So that one kind of sucks, but great facility. I hope he opens up something new. All right, back to Steven's thing here. 3,000, depending on how many pre-laps I do. Yeah, that's not enough milliamp hours to use it all, so we're not hitting voltage cutoff. Excuse me. Yeah, you've got a weird one, Steven. So do me a favor. Let's hit me up an email and we'll get you sorted out. Okay, does Tecan offer a way to upgrade from Gen 1 to Gen 2? Yeah, definitely. Go to our website, go to the service tab, and go download the service request form. Basically, you can turn in a Generation 1 and get it to a Generation 2. I don't remember the cost off the top of my head, but it's very reasonable. Obviously, you get a brand new unit. We don't do refurbs. Get you a factory warranty. Get you straight handled and sorted out. But that's definitely worth the upgrade at some point. You basically all you need to do that is download that service form. Go ahead and shoot support@teamtecan.com and a quick email just letting them know that, hey, I need an RMA number to upgrade my Gen 1 to a Gen 2. They'll shoot you a quick RMA number. Just make sure you put that on the service form. fill out the form completely, make sure you've got a good daytime phone number for contact, and send it in. And it usually takes 7 to 10 business days to get it back. Most of the time we're quicker, but I have to quote you 7 to 10 business days, especially since I'm on video. So 7 to 10 business days, I'm gonna get it sent out to you right away. Any chance you're gonna make an appearance at Motorama this year in February? Maybe. The Motorama race has been one of those ones that I've never managed to get to myself. I've been wanting to get to it. It just always conflicts with another trade show and another event I would typically go to. But Motorama is definitely one of those races I've wanted to go to, just never managed to get there. So I'm hoping to get there. We'll see. I don't, no promises, but I definitely want to try to make that race this year. Oh, here's a question. Anti-squat compared to rear top shock position. All the way up middle hole, 3 degrees. Outdoor was great. When in indoors, changed top middle. Lost sod bite and exit corner. Okay, so I am not a suspension tuning guru and never claim to be a suspension engineer, because there's definitely some out there in the RC world. However, in my opinion, I don't generally change the top of the shocks and try to chase down corner traction or exit any kind of traction with a corner. I don't typically use the shock angle for that kind of adjustment. Anti-squat though can definitely affect your traction going in and out of the corners. You can get to a point where less is helpful, and then you can get to a point where less is not helpful. Typically, in my opinion, more anti-squat generally gives you a little bit more side. It is not the adjustment or the first adjustment I would generally reach for when it comes to side bite. When it comes to side bite, I'm generally looking for things that affect camber gain. So I would have had to watch the truck, but for example, in a short course truck, if it's dumping, that's where most guys start reaching for the shock angle position, and I would generally agree with that. However, I would probably still go for a camber length change at that point, either lengthening it or moving the ball stud, depending on each truck. Is there vertical ball studs, or I have to move up and down a hole. And the reason why I go for camber length adjustments more than I do for shocks right away is that if I'm happy with the way the truck jumps, or if I'm happy with the way the truck is around the bumpy sections of the track, I generally try not to change the shock package around. I'll try to get my leverage is better on my tire as far as the contact patch, and that's what camber gain is all about. Camber gain is obviously when the tire travels up and down as suspension travel. Camber gain is the amount of camber you gain as the suspension travels up and down. So you got to kind of look at that, and if you think about it, if the truck's dumping over to one side, the more camber gain you have, the more flat the contact patch is on the ground. And so that's why you typically adjust camber lengths for side traction. Accelerating out of the corner definitely can be affected by anti-squat. And so typically under acceleration, the less anti-squat hat you have, the more forward traction you have. And you basically said that you started off at 3 and then went to 1.5, or you're thinking about going to 1.5. That's probably not the adjustment I would do. I would definitely start looking at your camber lengths and also ride height, and making sure your truck's not sitting too tall or too low. It'd be more helpful to realize and ask if the truck was dumping over, or is it just sliding out? That would be the next question I'd ask you as a driver. What would cause excessive heat buildup and fade in a motor knowing that the gearing was optimal? Okay, good question. Heat buildup and motor fade, basically anytime a motor is getting too hot, even though you know the gearing is right, I start to look at bearings, drag on the drivetrain, drag on the car. Did the weight change in the car? Did something get added? Excuse me. The other thing is the rotor. In a motor that's repeatedly cycled at higher temperatures, the only thing that technically wears in a brushless motor are the bearings and the rotor. And the rotor doesn't technically wear so much as it does lose magnetism. You need a Gauss meter to check them, but basically the more and more times you heat cycle that motor at the higher temperature ranges, the more and more magnetism is lost. And so typically if that motor's run frequently, club races once a week, twice a week, it's run on the weekends, got a lot of runs on it, 9 times out of 10, when a motor starts getting really hot really fast, kind of out of nowhere, you're going to find that the rotor went soft or went bad. It lost a lot of strength. The other thing that goes with this is that if that's happening, you'll also notice that your brakes aren't as strong as you remember them being. You will also notice that if you're monitoring this, and I recommend it all stock racers do, you're using a lot more milliamp hours per minute or over the entire run than you do when the motor was fresh. So for example, let's say you get a brand new motor, your motor runs great, you're running your lap times, you're winning races, and you notice that you're running 1900 milliamp hours, give or take 100 millihours, 200 hours. Hey, this motor's kind of soft, something's kind of wrong, and you're running 2800 milliamp hours into that same battery pack. That's another indication that the rotor's going soft. The only way to check it's with a Gauss meter. I know I carry one. There's a couple out on the market that'll do it. And so typically that's the first thing I start looking at. Another thing that can cause it also is a shorted wind. However, this isn't generally the first thing most guys will notice. Most things they'll notice is that the car's got excessive drag brake. So if you ever have a shorted wind, but yet the motor still runs because it's a mild short, you'll have a motor that has no punch, no top speed, it has a lot of battery usage, and it makes an immense amount of drag brakes, even though there's none turned on in the speed controller. So those are some things that can cause excessive heat and motor fade, even though the gearing is good. Okay, here's a good question. I've heard people talking about the wire length in the past. I've heard people say wires should be the same length. Is there any truth about matching the wire length? Okay, great question. The wire length typically doesn't affect a censored system as much as it affects a sensorless system, because on a sensorless system, the only feedback that the speed controller can get about the rotor's position is from whichever phase isn't being fired upon. So if the wires are different length, technically, the frequency, the time it takes for that signal to reach the speed controller can vary on each phase. That's why them being equal length in a sensorless system is actually quite helpful. Now, granted, you're docking down to resistance and some extremely low factors, in which case 9 times out of 10 nothing will hurt. But at the same time, if you can assure that you're making the maximum potential of that system by making the wires equal length as a racer, as a competitor, yeah, I'm going to do it. Now, in a sensor system, this isn't as important because we're not using those wire lengths in regards to the rotor position. We have the sensors for that job. So in that essence, it doesn't really matter. However, if they're extremely different for whatever reason in your particular install, one wire 6 inches longer than the other two, I would probably work on making that, making it closer to the exact same length, but that's really rare. I've never even seen that before, but just throwing it out there. If you run sensorless, yes, it's more important. If you run censored, not so much. And because you're probably talking to me, I'm going to assume you're running Tekin, hopefully, in which case the censored system's taking advantage of that and you don't really have to worry about it. But technically, yes, if they're the same length, it's more efficient, but really only in sensorless mode. Yeah, no worries. I mean, it's great talking to everybody. I'm glad everyone's enjoying it. We've got 30, 40 people watching online, so hopefully we can get some more questions going. And don't be afraid to ask a question. There's no stupid question other than the one you didn't ask. The question you're probably having in your head is probably the one that 15 other people are waiting for someone else to ask. So please, by all means, ask that question. But yeah, if anybody who's watching or anybody who's not watching or watching later, you need to set up help or questions, or you're just trying to sort your Tekin system out and make it as best as you can for the maximum lap times you can get out of this thing, shoot me an email at rpike@teamtekin.com, and I'll do the best I can to help you get your setup dialed in for your racetrack. One of the first questions I'll ask you is what car you're running, what's your gearing, what's your battery, what's your speed controller settings, how big is the track. So pictures or links to the pictures of the track or video of the track is really helpful. So if you can get me more of that information up front, the faster we can get you dialed in at the racetrack. So definitely get me that stuff and shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to help you guys out. So waiting for some more questions to roll in. Hopefully we get some stuff going. All right, guys, we got another couple minutes here. If I don't get any more questions, I am going to sign it off and be done. We're a little bit past time, but I don't mind staying on as long as there's some questions coming in. Can I talk about the new brush crawler line, new 30 turn and 40 turns? Sure. We did release brush motors for Tekin. And a new wind style, the 30 turn and 40 turn. These are our new hand wound pro version motors. So these are going to be hand wound in 30 turn and 40 turn. I don't really do a whole lot of crawling personally. I think Ty at Tekin's one of our best crawler guys that we have doing that stuff. But I do know that due to the changes in the crawler market, wheel speed, weight of the cars, drivability, the new 30 turn and 40 turn motors have just basically performed better than a traditional 35 or a 45 or a 55 turn motor. Because crawler has gone from back when it first started to 2S, now we're up to 2S, 3S, and 4S. The winds have kind of gotten transitioned to different wind styles as well. And so guys are looking for a little bit more wheel speed and when they're crawling, especially with the scalers. And so these motors really provide that extra wheel speed and still provide the drivability and everything they need. So all the team drivers have just been really happy with those additions to the standard winds of 35 and 45. And it's nice because the hand wounds stagger the standard HD brush motors, which are 35, 45, and 55 still. So now when you go to the hand wounds, you've got a little bit of an option going. So it's kind of nice to have them. You have any cool tools that you really like that people don't normally like? For example, flush cut zippers. Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously my background's automotive, so I worked for Dodge Chrysler Jeep for 12 or 13 years. We always had cool trinkety tools and little things laying around. And when I race a lot of 8 scale, one of the ones I use quite frequently for whatever reason is a windshield wiper arm removal tool, or also a battery terminal removal tool. And it looks like a clamp. And on some of the cars nowadays, the bearings that fit onto the differentials are so tight that once you get it on there, you really can't get it off. And this is especially kind of a pain in the butt when you're shimming a differential and the shims have to go behind the bearing. And so you can get a battery terminal removal tool for $10 at your local auto parts store, and they actually work perfectly for pulling the diff bearings off. And that actually was one of my tips of the week on my Facebook fan page, showing guys using a tool like that as far as pulling off those bearings, which is kind of nice. But yeah, there's definitely some tools that I use. I use some Snap-on small files that I have from working on cars. I carry those in my pit box. Digital calipers from back in the days that we've always had. Those are always nice to have. And I still use a lot of Mobile One products from my Viper service days and stuff like that. I tend to use like the Mobile One greases on my gears and things like that, just because I know they've proven in those high load things that they work better. So in an RC car, they really can't be all that bad. But yeah, to me, flush cut snippers are one of the nicer tools, so that's for sure. For someone new in the hobby, which is more important to start with, the kit or the electronics? This is a good question. I think it really depends on what you're starting in, but I'm going to just approach it from the racer area. The kits nowadays are so good. Even the ready-to-run kits are so good. They're so close to being a full production race car that I actually think, as far as getting up to race speed faster, it is far more beneficial to have better electronics than it is the kit itself. However, and the other most important thing about your racing, for example, is tires. So the kit tires, aren't usually that good. So having the proper tires for your car usually takes a lot of frustration out for the new drivers. You see guys out there in the short course class racing on stock slash tires. He's having a really hard, goes in and spends, $40-50 on some racing tires. And even a stock slash can get around the racetrack relatively well with just a good set of tires on it. So Tires are definitely one of the biggest things, but between the kits and the electronics, I think the electronics play a little bit more of a part just because the kits are so good now. I mean, a ready to run, say, for example, a 22 SCT ready to run two-wheel drive short course is 90% of a full factory race kit. I mean, it's so close that it really doesn't matter for the average guy, where the electronics that come with the ready to run cars are usually pretty archaic, usually sensorless, and that's really hard to drive consistently. So that's where the electronics kind of come into play, in my opinion. The T8i is obviously an indoor motor. What is your opinion of running them outdoors? I have a really positive opinion of running it outdoors because that's what's in my car. Here's the trick, or here's one of the reasons why I don't always suggest the T8i for everybody, but if you'll notice, guys like Ryan Letts run it. Adam Drake runs it from time to time, depending on the racetrack. Elliott Boots won the BRCA Nationals running a T8i. The T8i motor was originally designed to be an 8-scale indoor motor, specifically designed for the 8-scale light class. Now, the difference between the 8-scale class and the 8-scale light class is essentially no minimum weight class. There's no spec for that. So you can run the lightest 8-scale class or car you possibly can in the light class. So a lot of guys try to run two-wheel drive short course motor or four-wheel drive short course motors, 2S and things of this nature, but the T8i was meant for 3S and 4S specifically because that's what 8-scale really needs to run for voltage. The T8i is a smaller diameter but long can, so it's even longer than a four-wheel short course motor, so it really gives you the torque you need for the heavier 8-scale car, especially when there's extra traction from the 8-scale and the suspension is just better than a short course truck, etc., etc. Now, if you're going to run the T8i outdoors, here's the critical part. Your buggy needs to be at or near minimum weight, which is 3,200 grams if I'm not mistaken. So Ryan Letts' DEX408 buggy is hitting the track at 3,250 grams, depending on the tires he's got on the car, whatever the little differences can be, make up the grams. My Techno buggy that I've been running lately is literally 3,205 grams, depending on which tires I have on the car. So as you can see, we're at minimum weight. And why a lot of full-time 8-scale racers like Adam Drake and Ryan Letts like about this is those are pretty much the same weights that their nitro buggies are going to be. So what's nice is now in the 8-scale class, they can run their nitro buggy suspension setups on the exact same car, but just electric powered. So the cars feel almost to them. The other bit is it has a smoother power band. That smoother power band can prevent wheel spin. You can get on the lap times better, but it does give up a little bit of torque to the full-size T8 motors. The other downside to it is truck or buggy minimum weight, or you're running on an extremely large racetrack, it can run warm to hot. So if you're going to try the T8i in an outdoor track, you definitely need to make sure your car is lightweight. You need to make sure that your gearing is spot on, and then run the car. And I suggest running it at 5 minutes, checking temps, running at 7 minutes, checking temps, running it at 9 minutes, checking temps, and then run the full pull. And as long as you can get that motor under 200 degrees with that setup, you're fine. And that's typically when I run that car, even on the big Silver Dollar outdoor track with 180 foot, 190 foot straightaway, my motor's not coming off more than 185, 190 degrees. So definitely take that into account. But you can run it outdoors. The trick is just to run your car at minimum weight. Okay, so Tom's come back and his going back to the anti-squat or shock change, his rear end is sliding out. Okay, so if your truck is sliding out, especially on a four-wheel drive short course truck, what typically is the problem is you're not transferring weight to that side of the car. So in other words, you're making a left-hand turn, the weight's not transferring over to the right-hand side. So the first adjustments I would make are actually just to shorten the camber link and get some camber gain out of that and basically soften up that rear corner. You can also obviously adjust the shocks. And so if you're going to make a shock change, you can start leaning the shocks in. What leaning the shocks in does is it, one, gives you more progressive suspension. As a suspension travels, it's more progressive. It also softens the initial travel, which allows the weight to start transferring. So in other words, it starts the transfer. Again, though, if you're making a decision between those two changes and you really like how the truck jumps with the shocks leaned upwards, I would start reaching for a camber link change. You can start changing the anti-squat, but I don't think that's going to be the adjustment that you necessarily want. I would go for a shorter camber link and go from there. Do you know the good starting gearing for a Tekin Gen 295 and an SC10? Yeah, absolutely. So typically, I would start suggesting that to be like an 84-22 on an average 10 scale size track. I'm also going to assume that running that car, you're going to either be in blinking mode or close to it. So that would be the next question is, are you going to plan on running any boost or anything of that nature? A 9.5 is a pretty good start for an SE10, especially on a shorter indoor track. It won't wheelie as much. And so try to stick around in the 84, 21, 22 range, and then go from there. And obviously, if you've got some questions after that, hit me up by email or online or however you want to get a hold of me, and then we can make the adjustments from that point on. But a 9.5 and an SE10, 84, 21, 84, 22 should be pretty close on most indoor tracks. All right, guys, we're out of questions at the moment. So if we don't get any new questions within the next 5 minutes, I'm going to shut her down. And either way, I'm going to shut it down about 9 o'clock because I'm already about 30 minutes. I'll be about 30 minutes over the time I originally started this thing out at. So if you got some questions, fire them off. If not, it'd be great having you guys watch and appreciate you stopping by. Okay. Back to my name question. Blinking Moon Outback Raceway. Okay, so if you're running it Outback, that's about a 4,500, 4,800 square foot track. The current layout that I saw the other day on Live RC, my gearing recommendation is pretty much spot on. If you need a little bit more bottom end, you can drop to a 20-tooth pinion. Now, running blinking mode, make sure the motor timing set around 10 to 12 degrees on the can, which should be pretty close to how it was when you pulled it out of the package. But just in case you changed it, make sure you drop the gearing back down and then run the 84-21 gearing to start, and then let me know how your lap times are and then how it feels around the racetrack. Do you have enough pop? Do you have enough speed? And kind of go up and down from there. Yeah, thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. I know this is only the second time I've done it, so I'm still learning the application and kind of messing with this thing. And right now it's just a little bit of impromptu questions and stuff like that. But we will be doing some more things. I know we did a data logger clinic that had a lot of guys checking stuff out. So if you have any ideas or there's some specific topics that you'd like me to go over, I just asked that you guys post those to me on social media. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, obviously, Google+. So if you got specific topics, we'll try to round all those up at one time and kind of turn it into a little Q&A session or do a whole clinic about how to do certain things with specific themes and ideas. So just shoot me those information on social media and go from there. Yeah, likewise, appreciate everyone stopping by. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. And we're back down to no questions, guys. So I'll answer questions till about 9 o'clock, and then I'm going to shut it down. If you got any questions, go ahead and fire them off real quick, and we'll get those handled. Yeah, thanks for stopping by, Krager. Catch you later. Yeah, I think I'm gonna go ahead and shut it down, guys. Thanks for stopping by. Appreciate everyone asking their questions and helping me out and answering good critiquing questions and general questions. And we'll get some stuff going. Appreciate it. Everyone have a good evening.